liturgical scholars at one time, and this is really outdated, but about 100 years ago, late 19th century, early 20th century, there were quite a few liturgical historians who were arguing that the rites of Christianity, early Christian rites in the ancient church, were derived from these Hellenistic mystery religions. And many years ago, I read a fascinating book on the subject by one of those liturgical historians named Odo Kozel, who I believe was a German Catholic scholar. And I don't recall the title of the book, but that's one that's worth reading if you're interested in pursuing that subject a little more. Now, a later generation of liturgical historians and liturgiologists began to argue against that tradition because one of the things motivating that tradition is an anti-Semitism.
Right.
You most certainly could not find the roots of Christianity in ancient Judaism. You had to find it somewhere
Correct.
else. And so you would find later liturgical historians such as Jean Danielou, Cardinal Jean Danielou, who writes a book called The Bible and the Liturgy, which is an absolutely fascinating book. But his whole introduction to that book is writing against the previous generation's attempt to root early Christian practices in pagan religions. And Danielou argues, no, you have to look at the Old Testament roots. And the typology of the ancient Christian church very clearly explains the rites of Christian
Right.
baptism and the Eucharist and their other liturgical customs by means of Old Testament antecedents using
Right.
typology. But anyhow, I think that's important to bear in mind. But I do think that you can say, at least by the time you get to the fourth century, and you can even see some evidence of this prior to the fourth century, there is quite a bit of pagan influence that comes into the church and shapes the way Christians understand these rites of initiation. Now, one
Right.
example of that, and I mentioned this, and I don't remember if it was in the last episode we did on Justin or the one we did on Pliny. um, I mentioned the mystagogical catechesis of um, Cyril of Jerusalem, who lived in the fourth century, bishop of Jerusalem in the mid fourth century. So by this time, in the mid fourth century, Jerusalem was in ruins. It had been, totally um, devastated in not only the invasion of Jerusalem by Titus of Rome in the first century, but also the Bar Kokhba revolt, which led to another destruction of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was refounded as a pagan city, and it was completely destroyed. And by the time Cyril came to Jerusalem in the mid fourth century, it was still in ruins. But Constantine had converted in the early fourth century. Christianity had become popular and would very soon become the state religion. And everybody in Cyril's day not only wanted to become Christian, but Christians from all over the Roman Empire wanted to visit Jerusalem and to go to the various holy sites, the place where Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the place where he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jerusalem, and so on. Constantine had built great Christian monuments, basilicas, places of worship at all of these different places, and pilgrims from all over the place were coming to uh, Palestine, the Holy Land. I was going to say the Holy Land, so I use the air quotes, Palestine, to visit these sacred sites and to reenact, what happened in a liturgical drama of some sort. Now, in Cyril's explanation of the rites of initiation, one thing Cyril does is he draws on these pagan mystery religions and explains that the process of mystagogy, which is the process one would go through to be initiated into one of these pagan cults, um, the process of mystagogy in these pagan religions is like the process you're going through now. So Cyril is talking to all of these pagan Romans who want to become Christians, and he's explaining the rites of Christianity in terms of their pagan religions in a way that they would understand it. And so more and more that pagan influence, I think, crept into the church and began to shape the way Christians understood the Christian rites and Christian worship.
Well,
Yeah,
we
it was
see a lot of
that
analogs to that even
uh,
today.
It's always that. I mean, that's we know from the Old Testament as well. That's a perpetual challenge, is it not? A temptation to uh, allow idolatrous elements, really what they are, in to pervert the purity of the instituted rites that Christ has instituted for
Right.
us.